Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. Thanks so much for listening. Before we talk about this week's show, I want to thank all of you that have contacted the Jefferson Hour, decided to support the Jefferson Hour. If you'd like to do so, go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. There's a bunch of options, and we really, really appreciate it. While you're there, you can catch up on the show and find out what Clay's up to. This week, 10 Things episode with Lindsay Chervinsky, of course, answering a listener's email.
My friend Thad from Louisville sent this really extraordinary email basically saying, how do we deal with the basic, obvious, incontestable inconsistencies at the center of Thomas Jefferson's life? How did he manage it? And are we getting it right? But he doesn't seem to have been terribly debilitated by these contradictions, slavery, his financial problems, the way he treated his political enemies, his capacity, his rage for order, and yet the messiness of the world around him. It's a really extraordinary letter from a new friend. And Thad is a lawyer. He's been involved in a number of my online courses. He's writing a book about his brother's service in Vietnam. And so he sent this letter, and I thought, this is exactly right, because I've thought you and I have been talking about these things for 20 some years, David. We've been through every one of them in one way or another. And yet I want Lindsay, this fresh new voice, not only fresh to the Jefferson Hour, but fresh to American historiography. I wanted her to talk about these things. And I was really pleased with her analysis on this program.
Yeah, as always, and we're short on time this week. I am short on time.
Me too.
I have another phone call I have to get to, so it'll be the pleasure of our listeners to have such a short podcast.
One of the brief podcast introductions. So Lots going on. Go to the website, jeffersonhour.com. Listening to America is moving forward. Online courses are coming, including one on the 10 most iconic photographs in American history. Et cetera, et cetera. All the cultural tours out on the Lewis and Clark Trail, the 2 winter encampments at Lochsa Lodge, et cetera. And France coming up in November, and we're planning Greece for the year following. So a trip to Jefferson's Homeric Greece. All of that and more at jeffersonhour.com. David, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're so pleased you've joined us this week. Another 10 Things episode with our special guest, Lindsay Chervinsky, and of course, the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And Clay, I'm going to hand this off to you right from the start because it's a 10 Things episode, but it's a bit different than the ones we've done before.
Well, the great thing is that we get really interesting correspondence from listeners, and this is a friend of mine named Thad of Louisville. And we've been sort of writing back and forth about Jefferson's legacy, and he wrote me this letter, which I've sent both to you and to Lindsay for us to use as our 10 Things template for today. And he's really asking about how a person with common sense would look at Jefferson's inconsistencies and just be bewildered.
Shall we go to his list and get right into it then, sir?
Yes, you lead us through it, please. I'm very interested. I'm so interested in Lindsay's response to this because here's why. I've been thinking about this literally for 35 years. So the first time I ever encountered Jefferson, I was aware that he was a slaveholder. Very soon thereafter, I realized that he died hopelessly in debt and that he managed his money so very badly. For a long time, the whole Sally Hemings story was dismissed as prurience and impossible, out of character for Jefferson. Then there's the question of Jefferson and Native Americans, his vision of the westward future of this country. And so you don't have to be with Jefferson very long to be aware of the fact that there's a gap, always a little gap, and sometimes a very large gap between his vision and his, I won't say rhetoric because that seems like a belittling term, but his language, and then his actual status and his actual behavior and decisions in life. And so I thought it was a really interesting set of questions that were put to me by my friend Thad, and I would really like to hear a younger historian who didn't grow up, I grew up in the era when Jefferson was still the king, and he was the most important of the founding fathers, and his reputation was enormous at that time. And slavery at that time was seen as sort of an accidental, almost an asterisk in Jefferson's life, but he was given a pass on that question. And things have changed so dramatically that I think it's in danger of engulfing Jefferson from the other perspective. And I really think Lindsay's going to be able to help us sort this out.
I'll start with this one. He writes, of course, the Jefferson of history is of extraordinary importance. He is so fascinating as a person, and he would like a modern perspective on not mainly what Jefferson did, but why he did what he did.
Really starting off with a small question there. So I so appreciated this email because these questions are some of the things that have often frustrated me the most about Jefferson, and the things that I find hardest to explain in a satisfactory manner, other than to say humans are complex and often don't live by their own set of professed values. So I think actually, Clay, you're going to be really surprised by a lot of my answers, because while I generally am tougher on Jefferson, I also think that we as humans are shockingly flawed. And I would challenge everyone to sort of take a hard look at their own life. So for example, let's say you are very concerned about climate change. What kind of car do you drive? Do you get on an airplane regularly? How do you set your thermostat in your house? Do you reuse plastic, or do you only have single use? So there are a lot of things that we as humans care about, but then our actions are often inconsistent with those values. And I think that's one of the best ways to understand Jefferson, is he's someone who was masterful at compartmentalizing. He had his beliefs, he had the things that he held to be very important, but then it was often inconvenient to apply those to the rest of his life, or to find a way to make them fit with his other goals and desires and aims. And that's absolutely not a justification. And especially as we get towards the slavery part of this conversation, I will in no way be justifying or excusing. But I do think we have to also recognize that sometimes that hypocrisy lives within us all.
We are all tissues of inconsistencies. Almost nobody lives a life of complete logical consistency or complete integrity. But you will admit, Lindsay, that if you had to say of the founding fathers, who's the one with the most inconsistency to have to come to terms with, that person is Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, 100%. He is the most obviously hypocritical and duplicitous in what he professes, and then how he embodies those things in his life, which perhaps is one of the reasons there are so many books about him and people have been so fascinated for so long, and there's so much to still grapple with, because it is often hard to explain these things.
Let's take an easy one. Jefferson was publicly frugal and privately profligate, and died helplessly in debt, and towards the end of his life was really engaged in what I would say is unethical financial activity, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, almost check kiting, borrowing quietly money. Someone leaves him $10,000 to invest. He loans it immediately to himself, forgets all about it. 20 years later, the person wants their money back. Jefferson suddenly remembers it. He scrambles, borrows from somebody else. It's not a pretty picture. And you would think that a man of his intelligence, and with a tremendous record of public financial responsibility, would find that so difficult to see in the mirror that it would undo him, that either he would have to reform, or he would have to say, I have to account for this somehow. But he doesn't. He always ducks that issue, as he always effectively ducks most of the issues where he's inconsistent. So what's that about? Is that a disease of the mind? Is that an advantage of his character and psychology? How do you account for this? Because you wouldn't be able, if your house was about to be foreclosed upon, I don't think that you would buy a round-the-world cruise. I don't think that you would order case after case of Bordeaux. So what's that about, do you think?
So I'm loath to use 21st century terminology on an 18th century psychology because we don't really know and it's impossible. And I'm certainly not a professional psychologist by any stretch. But I have always gotten the sense that there's a little bit of the narcissist in Jefferson, not like full-blown sociopath, but there's a little bit of unwillingness to examine his own actions. And he is always sort of in the right. And of course, there are letters where he's sort of self-deprecating and that kind of thing. But to me, it almost, and maybe this is not fair, and a lot of this is just sort of sense and gut feeling. But when he says those things, I always kind of feel like that's putting on of the Republican virtue. Like, oh, I'm not qualified to do that. And that's just because that's what one said at the time.
Unless one were Hamilton.
Well, yeah, obviously. Or Burr, for that matter. But I have always felt that there just is this sense that he, and maybe self-involved is a better way to think about it, but all of his relationships revolved around him. All of his relationships depended on his happiness. So he wanted Monroe and Madison near him, even if it wasn't a good financial choice for them. He wanted his daughters at his home, even if it wasn't the right thing for their families. He wanted them to marry who he wanted so that they would be close. There was often real manipulation to ensure that things worked to his own advantage. So I don't know if self-involved is the right word. I don't know if selfish is the right word, but there is a distinct lack of consideration for how these things will affect other people and a willingness to analyze his own actions.
David, you're the semi-permanent guest host of the Jefferson Hour. You've been living with Jefferson for almost a quarter of a century. Surely you have insights about this.
Well, actually, earlier than that, I remember my father bringing home a copy of Fawn Brody's book when it was fairly new, which was actually the first book I ever read on Jefferson. But I want to go back to this question and hear from both of you. I mean, you know, the way the question was written and the way I read it, essentially what he's asking is, what is Jefferson's motivation? Now, Lindsay, you pretty much just said he was manipulative and self-absorbed and he was doing it for himself. I have trouble going quite that far. What do you say, Clay?
It's a paradox and it's a mystery, and nobody has ever successfully made sense of it. It really is one of those great mysteries. And part of me wants to use psychological terms. I would never say narcissist, and I'm even uneasy with manipulation, but somehow it lived in a kind of a dream world of his own, which was only lightly tethered to the ground, and imagined America and imagined Monticello and imagined his friendships and imagined a republic. And the fact that it was grubbier than that and never quite reached that level of perfection or utopia, obviously that mattered to Jefferson, but he liked to live in that sort of cloud of dreamy optimism, I think, about himself and about his purposes, certainly about his integrity as a visionary and as a political thinker. And I've never met anyone like that. Everyone has a little of this, certainly all romantics do, but I think Jefferson had it in a very special quantity, which makes his greatness. At the same time, it perplexes us to the point of deep frustration. Does that make sense, Lindsay?
It does. And, you know, I think the dream world quality is a good one. I think he was motivated by, most of the time, what he thought would be most enjoyable. So he didn't buy the cases of Bordeaux because it was the right thing to do. It was because he liked it and he enjoyed drinking fine wine. And I certainly don't hold that against him. I enjoy fine French wine too. And he didn't, you know, tear down Monticello again and again and again because he thought that he did think he was creating this beautiful architectural masterpiece, but it was because what he wanted, and it didn't really matter if it made the house uncomfortable for anyone else. And so I don't think any of those choices, at least the financial ones, I don't think they were malicious in nature, certainly not malicious in intent, but I just don't think he could ever really see the impact on other people.
We need to take a short break. I am really anxious to hear more from the both of you, and I hope I shall. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a 10 Things episode, which has sort of fallen into trying to understand Jefferson. As you pointed out, Clay, I've been living with Jefferson for quite a while as the semi-permanent guest host. That's right?
That's correct. You have a sign in your office.
Somewhere I do, yes. You're both being pretty hard on this guy, and so I got to come back from that standpoint and say, well, did he do anything good?
Of course.
Well, let's hear about it.
We wouldn't be asking these questions if he hadn't done good things. People would not be trying to grapple with how to understand him if he hadn't been one of the most impactful figures from 1775 to 1825.
Well, let's pick something good he did and tell me what his motivation was.
Is that on the list of questions?
No, I made it up.
Well, I'll give you one. Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte. It wasn't his intention to do that. His intention was to find a way to keep the Mississippi River open. Napoleon dropped the Louisiana Purchase in Jefferson's lap. Jefferson was even then reluctant because he wondered about its constitutionality, but he made his peace with that, and it doubled the size of the United States for 3 cents per acre, and can effectively be called two things: the making moment of American destiny and the death of the American Republic. He bought an empire, and when you have an empire, you're going to behave like an empire. Any chance we had of being a modest little agrarian republic was deeply wounded, if not killed, by the Louisiana Purchase. So that was understood by Frederick Jackson Turner, by the way, in his famous Frontier essay of 1793. But unless you are a Native American or an advocate of indigenous people who simply is appalled by the idea that a French dictator who never saw the West could sell it to an American president who never saw the West, from a geopolitical point of view, you have to look at the Louisiana Purchase as one of the most extraordinary things that Jefferson ever did, and he handled it with his usual sophistication, nuance, and understanding of what it signified. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I do, and I would actually go farther, which is to say that I think this moment demonstrates his complex thinking about executive power and is a clear moment when he is grappling with his actions being different than his values. It's one of the few times that he's very explicit about knowing he is going back on what he has said. And he has, for the last several years, he had been an ardent advocate against executive power, or at least the restrictions of executive power. And he comes into office, and I would maybe make the bold claim that this is the greatest use of executive power in American history, perhaps. He doubles the size in one pen stroke, which is a pretty remarkable thing to do. And as you said, he was deeply uncomfortable with that. He did not feel that he had the constitutional authority to do so. He drafted a constitutional amendment. He shared it with his cabinet. They said, "What are you doing? Why are you trying to cause this problem? Put it away." He tinkered with it. He sent it to them again. They said, "Stop it." He tinkered with it. He kept it in a drawer just in case. He finally agreed to wait to see what Congress said, recognizing that this could potentially jeopardize the ratification of the treaty. And when Congress made no objection, he decided not to say anything, knowing that this was not in line with what he had previously said about executive power, but recognizing that it was the rational, realistic approach to foreign policy. So this is a moment where one might say the hypocrisy is understandable and clearly articulated, and he goes through these machinations to try and get comfortable with it.
David, another one of extraordinary importance is the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty of 1786. One of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of human freedom, the foundation for almost all such laws and pronouncements thereafter. that Jefferson understood something that was really important, and that is that a person's thinking, her conscience, their faith, their spiritual life is not a province of government. And we are free to believe in whatever God we please or none at all without civil reward and without civil penalty. He didn't invent this idea, but he brought it to Virginia and he made it stick, and it became the most important thing about Jefferson in European eyes. When he went to Europe, they didn't know that he had written the Declaration of Independence. Almost nobody knew that when he got there in 1784, but they soon learned that he was the author of that statute. And I would say, as an American, I would say two things. I want the Bill of Rights more than I want the Constitution, and I want the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty more than I want the Louisiana Purchase. This is Jefferson at his very best, and it took moral courage for Jefferson and Madison to advocate that at that time, Lindsay.
Yes, I'm in no agreement. I would argue that that's actually Jefferson's greatest contribution, and the one that we have perhaps as a society forgotten the most and could use a refresher on.
Let's go back to the Louisiana Purchase. Another question from Thad. He asks, why didn't he ever travel to the West? Now, I know from speaking with you, Clay, that he had a real fascination with the West. Thad says, I know he loved creature comforts, but he made it to England and France. Why not at least to the Mississippi?
Because there were creature comforts in England and France and none beyond the Appalachians. Jefferson is like Cleopatra. He has to have a barge. He has to have support vehicles. He has to have valets. He has to have enslaved people. He has to have someone to mind his horse, someone to make his bed. He wants wine. He wants a tablecloth. Jefferson's father was a frontiersman. For some reason, even though Jefferson worshipped his father, Jefferson did not get that gene. Jefferson is so comfortable in life. He loves his slippers, and he loves to have his books handy. He loves his horse waiting for him on the terrace. And remember, when he would go out to ride his horse, he would sometimes take a white handkerchief and he would rub the flank of the horse. And if it came up dirty, he'd go back in and make them curry it again because it wasn't clean enough for Jefferson. This is a highly civilized man in the most kind of sensual sense of being civilized. And the idea of him sleeping on the ground around the Lewis and Clark circle of fire is an impossible thing to contemplate. What say you, Lindsay?
I don't totally blame him in this. I'm not one for camping. I love to go explore. I love to hike. I like getting dirty and doing the adventure, but then I really like going back and having plumbing and a comfortable bed. So I don't totally hold this against him. I do think that sometimes he took it
That's your historical judgment, because I, Lindsay, like comfort. I forgive Jefferson for loving comfort. Well, rigorously analyzed.
Like I said, I'm not going to be mean on every question. This one is a little bit understandable. But, and I think sometimes it's, when we read the descriptions of like the things that he would buy, he would go to France, planning to live in France for a couple of years, and would remodel every house he moved into because it had to be just so. So, that's perhaps a bit extreme, but I'm a little bit less severe on this point than I am on the others.
I love this side of Jefferson. I think it's charming in some way. No wonder he died bankrupt, of course. I think his sense of what life is with a capital L, that the purpose of life is happiness. If he were alive today, he couldn't get away with his spending. But if he had money, imagine what he would buy today. For this magnificently elegant man to live in that world and to believe that he was somehow entitled to it.
We should say, since we are talking about the good, bad, and the ugly on this conversation, that his idea of the good life was only possible because he had hundreds of people to make it so.
Let's move to another question. He asks, why did Jefferson build Monticello, tear it down, then live in a construction zone during his retirement?
So I've obviously been to Monticello several times. I actually currently just finished up a fellowship there. And it's innovative. It's interesting. The scientific concepts are so fully on display. You can really get the sense of what he is trying to achieve. There are innovations and inventions that are remarkably fascinating. I think that unless you were Jefferson, it would not have been a particularly fun place to live. the house was not designed to be comfortable for anyone but him.
Even when finished.
Even when finished. The bedrooms on the second floor the windows are often at floor level because you don't want to obscure the exterior view. They were probably very hot because there wasn't a whole lot of airflow. There was not a whole lot of room for the family. That was private space because there was this big entry hall and then there were the entertaining rooms. If it were me and I were trying to choose a historic house to live in, it would not be my first choice.
Which would be your first choice then?
My answer is more complicated, and it depends on the year. If I could have the Adams house once the Stone Library is built, which obviously is later, that would be my answer, because that library is the stuff of dreams.
Fair enough. Well, look, this goes back to Jefferson's dreaminess. He had an idea of what a neoclassical dwelling should be. Unfortunately, he didn't have any money, and there weren't people of the skill sets in the New World to build that thing for him. But he had this dream. If Jefferson had been a billionaire, if he had never owned an enslaved person, he could have had an incredible life, but he didn't have the money to build Monticello. And so he goes to Paris. He builds the first version after a kind of a Palladian blueprint that he purchased in Williamsburg. He goes to France and he sees, that's what a really interesting Palladian villa looks like. I'll just tear that thing down and start over. If he had had a financial manager or a bank on whom he was dependent for loans, he wouldn't have been able to do it. But he just did it. And of course, he had enslaved labor, and that's sort of always a little fudge factor because he can make them bake the bricks and make them cut the timbers and make them tear down the walls and fetch the water and do all the things that today would simply be financial costs and contracts. So there's that side of his dreaminess too, I think. The famous story that I love most is when William and Anna Thornton came to visit. And he was tearing down the house as usual, and they came up during a thunderstorm, and the roundabout roads were absolutely crazy. And at one point, Jefferson got in the carriage, and he was going at breakneck speed, and she thought he was going to break her neck. They finally get to the door. They go in, and there's scaffolding everywhere, and instead of floors and ceilings, there are planks. And she says bricks are falling down. And it's just like a construction site. There's a kiln making kiln-like noises outside, and they're sawing and hammering. And Jefferson is serving tea to everyone and saying, "You're so welcome here." And she said he seemed oblivious to the fact that this was a really dangerous construction site, and he didn't seem to care that this was inconvenient for his family and his guests. For him, it was like, well, we're building a new nation, and we have a new capital in Washington, and the house will be finished at some point.
Yeah, I think that, and in fact, I think perhaps the most remarkable thing is that he got so many people to visit him despite those conditions.
No one came twice, except the Madisons.
Except the Madisons. The Monroes came, but that's kind of because I think he was forced.
And he was the lesser of the triad.
Yes.
David, what do you think? I mean, you've been involved in this so long. How do you see this?
Well, I really enjoy listening to the two of you, and there's part of me that's going, man, they don't think much of this guy.
Oh, I love him.
I mean, the Louisiana Purchase, granted, but as Lindsay said, it's hard to disagree with that. He was motivated so much by his own desires and wants, and to get the West, his fascination with it. Of course, he would do that. I imagine you could make the argument that was part of the motivating factor. But I want to go on to another one that's pretty obvious, a question from Thad, and that's why did he keep such meticulous records his whole life and yet never have his personal finances under control? Why was he obsessed with getting the government out of debt, but he was always in debt himself?
Again, I think that he just was like Mr. Magoo. He just couldn't see.
Wait a minute. Is that a professional historical term?
Do you know who Mr. Magoo is, Lindsay?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so I think he was Mr. Magoo. He's just wandering around half blind to everything going on around him, and he's in this kind of cloud of Palladian neoclassical joy. He was a record keeper, and here I will...
Wait a minute now. You guys are both professional, highly respected historians, and we're talking about a guy who has incredible monument in Washington, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who did all these things, and we've devolved to Mr. Magoo?
Don't be dumping on Mr. Magoo.
Oh, I like Mr. Magoo.
I like Mr. Magoo, and Jefferson was Magoo-esque, if I may use that term. I want to use a psychological profile, and I know Lindsay has warned us, but I think Jefferson, and I'm really interested in Lindsay's view of this. Here's my view. That Jefferson was a very highly emotional human being who had built a crust of stoic, classical restraint. And these two parts of his life didn't talk to each other very much. But he wanted to paper over all the darkness and the chaos and the madness and the Southern craziness of life, all of which was engulfing him after 1809. And so he lived in this sort of Palladian universe that he had built for himself. And one way to avoid having to face life was to count things, to make lists, to make grids, to get order by lists, by enumeration, by finding some Excel chart that you could put everything down. And, this year I'm going to get my correspondence in order, and I'm going to get my garden book, and I'm going to collect all the gossip from the Washington and Adams administrations and put it and bind it for the future. I think that was his lifeline to control in a world that was really much more chaotic and in some ways insane than he wanted to live in. What say you, Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's probably what we would think of today. He would have never used this terminology, but he was probably a little bit of an anxious person. And so control and order is a very helpful way to combat those feelings. It's one reason why he tore down his house and tore down his house and tore down his house, because he couldn't control his environment. It's one of the reasons that he liked to have people around him that he cared about, because he felt like it gave him some control over, not losing them not dying, their health. I think that applies to all of the other elements of things that he tracked so meticulously. It was one way of also, we can't control the weather, but if you document the weather, you can get a better sense of what the trends are. You can get a better sense of how things work. You can know what to expect. You can study these patterns. And he absolutely had a scientific mind. So he enjoyed studying these things. He enjoyed having answers. And in an age where there wasn't Wikipedia and there wasn't Google and there weren't these things at our fingertips, if you documented everything, it did give you some answers when you went looking for them. So that, I think, is all very understandable and in some ways very commendable. In terms of the finance piece, he was able to get the government debt under control because it didn't really affect his quality of life. He could cut government expenses or really instruct Albert Gallatin to, who was a brilliant financier and understood all of these things quite well. And it didn't really impact Jefferson's life in any way because all of his expenses at the White House he covered, as did all presidents for quite some time. In terms of his own personal finances, that would have been very unpleasant and inconvenient. And how often have we all gotten something in the mail, we don't really want to deal with it, and we throw it in a pile and say, well, we'll deal with it later. That's a very understandable human emotion. He just kind of did that for decades.
Agreed, Lindsay. Agreed with all of your analysis. This is not meant to be critical of Jefferson. What we're trying to do is understand Jefferson. And, we feel judgment at times, especially on the questions we're about to look at in the third segment here. But what we're really trying to do is make sense of a person who is so central to American life and yet so utterly mysterious in some fundamental way. So we'll take a short break. When we come back, David, I think it's time to listen to Thad on the questions of Sally Hemings and slavery. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're talking with our friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, the author of the extraordinary book on the creation of the cabinet in Washington's administration. Lindsay, Thad raised some very serious questions in his email to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and we're now about to face the big problem in Jefferson's life.
I'm glad that we are going to discuss this, and this is a subject that is really difficult to talk about in detail just because we want to address it with as much care and honesty as possible. We don't want to sugarcoat things. So I guess I would just encourage listeners, if you're, listening on the radio or on the podcast in the car and you have young children, maybe want to hit pause, come back later when you don't have them, because we will be covering topics like assault and cruelty and slavery. And so maybe not for young ears at this particular moment.
And this conversation, which happens so often on the Jefferson Hour and is inevitable in any conversation about Thomas Jefferson, has a capacity to be hurtful to adults too, because Jefferson held views that are hard even to squeeze out of one's mouth in the 21st century. And there's a complacency that happens in Jefferson's life on this question that is indecipherable for a person of conscience. And so whenever we get into this zone, I always think about the person driving a car in rural Virginia or Nebraska who suddenly flicks on to the public radio station and hears us talking about this issue in a way that could be very disruptive and even hurtful out of context. So this is the context of a man who lived between 1743 and 1826. And although he was the third president and one of the greatest Americans of his time, at the center of his life was a paradox so great that no one has ever been able to sort it out. So, David, what does Thad ask us to wrestle with here?
He says he was surprised that in American Sphinx, Dr. Joe Ellis's book, the original edition, he said he didn't think it was true, but now has changed his mind on that. And he asks, he wonders if you've always suspected it and even believed it well before the DNA analysis, which he says we have to agree is persuasive, but not conclusive.
I've always believed that it's probably true. I read Fawn Brodie's book when it came out in the 1970s. She was excoriated and publicly attacked. She said that it was quite clear that Jefferson had had an enslaved mistress or concubine or common law wife, however you want to describe it, victim maybe, and that they had had children together, and that this had been covered up for all these years, but that the evidence was clear and the psychology also plausible. And that story then resurfaces. It's always been around from 1802, but it resurfaces in the 1970s. She has been largely vindicated. I think her biography is actually an outstanding one, and one of the best, I think, of our time. And so I think many of us were in denial. We're in denial for a range of reasons, some of them not very admirable. And I think that the DNA evidence, with Annette Gordon-Reed's superb work on this subject, and our kind of loosening of the uptightness in American historiography, has allowed us to see what is almost certainly the case, that Sally Hemings and Jefferson were involved sexually for several decades. Lindsay, where are you on this subject?
So I had the benefit of learning about this history once all of this information was already out. One of the first books I was assigned in graduate school was The Hemings of Monticello. So
Annette Gordon-Reed.
By Annette Gordon-Reed, thank you. And so for me, it is a settled question. It is there is almost no plausible room for denial. And I think the problem is we are so eager to find another solution that we ignore things like Occam's razor, which is often the simplest explanation is the truest one. Now, I should say just a little bit of context for this time, and I think this is important, and this is in no way a justification, but is worth explaining. Jefferson was far from the only white man to have sexual relations with an enslaved woman. In fact, Sally Hemings was the half-sister of his wife, and her father was Thomas Jefferson's wife's father, so this was sort of a family tradition. It was understood by and sort of silently accepted by the elite class in the South that this is what happened. So it would not have been a shock to anyone. It would not have been a surprise to anyone. None of his contemporaries would have said that this was impossible or out of his character because it was such a common practice. I think to understand Jefferson's choices, we have heard sort of the family lore that he promised Martha he would not get married again. So that was certainly a consideration. He was a young man when that happened, so it's not unsurprising that he would want some sort of companionship later on. By the time he maybe could have been thinking about another marriage, he was a very famous man. He was a very famous American. And if he had been married again, that probably would have been a political story. So to his credit, it is understandable why he wouldn't have wanted to engage in another marriage with another white woman, because that would have been a very big topic of discussion. So I just think that's some important context to understanding this circumstance. I would also really encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to read Annette Gordon Reed's work, because I think she does a masterful job of showing the force and the violence that was a part of this relationship, but that it didn't obscure humanity, and that Sally Hemings had Sally Hemings had some agency over her own choices and used them to maximum effect to get what she wanted. Neither of those things obscure the other. Neither of those things erase the other.
So if it's true, and we're assuming that it is, what do we make of it? Because as you know, at one end of the spectrum, there are people that say that this was simply rape. I was once asked a question by a woman who said, when Thomas Jefferson was having sex with Sally Hemings, did he regard her as 3/5 of a human being? At the other end of the spectrum, as you know, there are people that say, well, this is a kind of star-crossed lovers, that there was genuine affection and companionship, that maybe they were really in love, and this was a time when this was taboo, and that they were together all those years, 30-some. That suggests that this was more in the range of consensual, and that her agency was probably pretty large. There are some who even say she might have angled for this because it was a family strategy of how to survive enslavement. You know all these perspectives exist, Lindsay. How do you sort it out?
I think that there was absolutely an element of coercion. He owned her, and he was responsible for her future. So even if she was very interested in this relationship, she would have been very aware of that fact. And it could not be ignored. It could not be denied. Even if he was very, very kind, that was never going to go away. So that element of coercion, even if it was never spoken about, even if there was never any threat implied, it existed. There was a power differential, and that...
You're saying that she couldn't really just say no.
Correct. She would have known that there would have been consequences. What I think is perhaps the most interesting element is that this relationship, I think, likely started while they were in France. And there is very good evidence to suggest that she knew, certainly James Hemings, her brother, knew about the laws on the books in France that prohibited slavery and allowed for the emancipation of enslaved individuals. And had she wanted to, she probably could have stayed in France, because Jefferson would not have wanted that particular scandal. And she could have chosen to do so. And I believe... I find the argument very compelling that she decided not to. She decided to go back with the understanding that at some point, her family would receive more beneficial treatment, and at some point her children would be emancipated. And that was the bargain she made. Now, I'm talking about this in sort of business-like terms. That does not mean that real affection didn't develop. We really have no way of knowing, because both of these individuals were incredibly private about it. I suspect that real affection did develop, otherwise it wouldn't have taken place for so long. I don't think we can ever talk about it as an either-or, however.
I think Jefferson was a harmony obsessive. I can't imagine overtly coercive sexual predation going on for decades. I'm sure that whatever it was, there was some sort of a tacit mutual understanding of the benefits of this and the compromises of this and the secrecy of this, and there's maybe the passion of this. There was a hard-headed bargain that she and her brother entered into with Jefferson about what would happen to both of them if they did come back from France with Jefferson. It was a family tradition in the Hemings family that this was one path through the horrible world of enslavement. And so I believe that Jefferson must have had, and this is speculation, of course, we don't know. I mean, he didn't write about this, and she didn't write about it. We have one oral story from after her time from one of her sons, but I can't believe that Jefferson would have been a ruthless slave rapist of the kind we sort of think about in Uncle Tom's Cabin kind of point of view. I think he's way too complex and suave for that, and he wouldn't have done it if it didn't involve a level of harmony. I know that may be speculative, Lindsay.
No, I think that that's right, because I think it would have been repugnant to his own self-identity that that's what it would have required. So even if, he wasn't all that concerned about how she felt about it, if he felt that it was forced, that would have been repugnant to how he saw himself, which I actually think is a really important factor to consider. The Jefferson defenders have put forth other alternatives for who could be the father of her children, none of which I find particularly compelling. But one of the main reasons I don't find that compelling is because if they were the father, then that would have meant that they would have taken advantage of her and forced themselves on her under his roof when he was around. And I can't imagine him turning a blind eye to that when it was clear it was happening if the product was children. So I think that for a lot of reasons, his distaste of that sort of violence should shed light on perhaps the nature of how this went down.
So, David, I think one of the best things ever said about this was said by John Adams. When the story broke in 1802 and circulated all through the country very quickly, Adams was asked about this, and in a private letter he said, well, I don't really know. It doesn't really sound like Jefferson, but he said, here's the important thing. It's inevitable in this institution. Slavery invites rape, period. That the very existence of slavery means that there is no red line that a slave master is not going to cross if it's in his interest to do so, so that the whole implication of slavery is abusive, and sexual abuse is one part of its abusive dynamics. And I think, I'm of course giving it slightly different language, but that's what John Adams said, and I think he's spot on.
In the decades that the relationship was supposed to have occurred, is there any credible eyewitness to this historically?
No.
Well, there's no one that saw
her tiptoeing out of his room.
Yes.
That we know of.
There's no one that we know of that saw her tiptoeing out of his room, although the location of her quarters would have made that nearly impossible, which Monticello now includes as part of their interpretation.
So is it reasonable to think that this could have gone on without any eyewitness evidence?
I would bet all of my pennies that his children knew. There's zero chance they wouldn't have known. But of course they were not going to talk about it, because that would have been insulting to their family image. That would have been insulting to their own identities, and it would have been insulting to their father's legacy, of which they were unbelievably protective. It was not uncommon for white families to deny these things even when the evidence was staring you in the face. The second piece that I want to say is the community accepted this story at the time. The contemporary community in Charlottesville accepted that this is what was going on. And the Black community and the descendant community passed down a family tradition. And we do them a great disservice if we don't treat that as contemporary evidence, because they got nothing from claiming this heritage. It's not like it helped them in any way. The people who were going to be freed in his will, and after he was dead, it was not like there was money that they could claim from the family. So we have to take that testimony as evidence, and it is, I think, incredibly disrespectful to dismiss it out of hand.
Which historians used to do until the last 15 or 20 years, and now that's really changed. dramatically. I so agree with what you said, Lindsay, about his children. So Polly, the younger one, dies in 1804, but Martha lives on until 1836, and she was the closest to Jefferson. They were doppelgangers in many important respects. She might have edged in a little bit about this and got into a zone where she felt, okay, no, not going there. And this happened a lot, but it especially happens with Jefferson. Jefferson had an aura. He sent out a vibe to the world that there are certain things that you don't confront him with. So person after person who's an abolitionist, Joseph Priestley and Alexander von Humboldt and Thomas Paine and so on, are dear friends of Jefferson. And there's no evidence that they ever said, hey, Jeffy, how do you live with this thing? There was just kind of a tacit understanding that Jefferson was above all of this and that you don't confront him. And because of that, that vibe went even to his children. I believe that Jefferson knew that his daughter knew, and his daughter knew that he knew, and they both lived together. Once in a while, you can get a slight hint from her of anxiety about all these things, but she never makes a statement that could be construed as knowing what's going on. That's Jefferson, I think.
To end on a positive note, I just want to thank everyone. I received so many lovely get well messages from my foot, and I am hopeful that by the time this airs, I will be bootless, which will be a just delightful development. And I was so cheered by everyone's messages, and it meant a lot. So I just really want to thank you all for being such kind listeners and reaching out. It really made my day.
And what a bunch of gender bias. I nearly die on Mount Whitney. I don't get a single letter. Lindsay stubs her toe, and flowers are coming in Bordeaux wine, and people are sending her leashes for her dog, and, we hope you will survive, and give me a break,
No. Let me settle
this
you both
is so
down.
Lindsay.
Lindsay, it's so much fun to have you on the show, and I so appreciate the fact that I get to listen to the two of you exchange historical views. It's my pleasure, and thank you so much.
I'm sure you're hearing from podiatrists as we speak.
Now say goodbye.
You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.